People gonna start up. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to COVID edition number 5 of the monthly E2 meetings. Obviously, we've had an interesting summer and spring, and it looks like we'll be in this venue for the foreseeable future, right, Marcy and Eric?
That's how I see it.
I'm not sure what other companies are doing for Eversource. We're still all working remotely, and it looks like we'll be doing that for a while still, given everything that's going on. So I'm not sure we'll be able to get together for some time. Marcy, we'll just say a couple things about our October, normally in the summer conference, which is now on October 2nd, will be virtual.
Yes, we will be doing a virtual format for the conference. We have condensed the conference to be a half a day.
Just remind everybody, mute yourself if you're not speaking. Thank you.
So we've condensed the conference, so it will be a half a day format. We will still be doing the plenary session that we would typically do in the conference with the task force updates, followed by virtual breakouts. We'll have 2 segments of breakouts. We will also be having a keynote address from the EPA Administrator, Dennis Denzel. And we're working on a final breakout in the afternoon for manufacturers to meet with the Department of Environment and Energy Protection. And I'm hoping to have an agenda out in the next couple of weeks.
Background noise. So please mute yourself if you're not speaking.
And just to tack on to that a little bit, you know, we normally have the manufacturing only breakout, and we are in the process of organizing that as well to be a part of this. But unlike normal years where it's happening sort of simultaneously with other things at the conference, it'll be, at least the plan right now is to have it at the conclusion after the EPA keynote at the end of the day. So we're still going to make that happen, but obviously it's going to be a little bit different setup. So.
Since we're all together now, does anybody else have any kind of a general announcement for the good of the order before we move into our presentation from the DEP Air Bureau? Okay. Dave or Steve, want to introduce our speakers?
Sure. Steve couldn't be here today, so I'll give a quick intro. Good morning, everybody. Thanks to Ricky Bouffard and Robin Baina from DEEP who are joining us this morning to talk about the NOx RACT program, which we're in phase 1 of that program, but phase 2 is coming, and for there's a number of deadlines for that. So phase 2 officially takes effect in 2023, but there are certain things that start to come into play as early as January of next year. So timely stuff, and we appreciate them being here. So Ricky and Robin, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I think I'm unmuted now. Yeah, okay. So, thanks for the introduction and the opportunity to speak here today. I do recognize a handful of names on here, but some of you I don't know. So I'll start with introducing myself. My name is Ricky Bouffard. I'm the supervisor of the Administrative Enforcement Division in Air Bureau of DEEP. And I have with me Robin Baina. She's one of my senior engineers, and she's kind of the one that's dissected this regulation and has drafted an order to, you know, for compliance for phase 2 actually already. So we've been tasked, my group, with implementation and enforcement of this new revised NOx RACT regulation. It was promulgated, I think, late 2016 and became effective 2018, as Dave has indicated. Kind of, as a result of the 2012 redesignation for marginal non-attainment for ozone, so we're obligated to revise our regulations to try to obtain further reductions in NOx. And the regulation is broken up into 2 different areas. It's 22E and 22F. And 22E is for control of NOx from fuel burning equipment at major stationary sources of NOx. And 22F is for high daily NOx emitting units at non-major sources of NOx. So a lot of the minor sources are able to opt out and just do more maintenance, where the major sources are subject to 22E. So it is broken into 2 phases. The first phase became effective June 1st of 2018, and it goes until May 31st of 2023. So we're in the middle of phase 1 right now. And then phase 2 starts June 1st, 2023, and it heads out to, I think, May 1st of 2028. And there's 3 different ways. Robin will get into the details of the regulation, but there's essentially 3 ways to comply. And the first one is to just comply with the emission limits. And the other 2 is in the form of the submission of a plan to DEEP. And the first one is to comply with the established compliance options in the regulation. And if a company is not able to, if it's like technologically or economically infeasible to comply with that or with the emission limits, they can submit a plan for a case-by-case demonstration. And so options 2 and 3 need to be memorialized through a permit or an order. And as David indicated, there are some deadlines. So for the case-by-case plan, it does take longer for us to evaluate it and analyze it. So the deadline for that is January 1st, 2021, so it is coming up. And if you plan on complying using one of the established compliance options, the deadline is September 1st, 2021, so it's essentially a year from now. And that's essentially all I'm going to say at this point. So I'm going to let Robin kind of go through more of the details. And so, I mean, I'm thinking for the purposes of this, if you have a question to clarify something she's saying, I would say feel free to ask along the way. But if you have just a more generic question, maybe it'd be easier to wait till the end of Robin's presentation so then she can properly address that. So Robin, are you ready?
Sure. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. You're good.
Okay. And so the next slide. And as Ricky already said, there's 2 regulations within this NOx RACT. 22E applies to the fuel burning sources at major sources of NOx. All boilers serving EGUs, reciprocating engines with capacities greater than 3 million BTUs per hour, and both combined cycle and single cycle turbines, ICI boilers, and other fuel burning equipment with capacities greater than or equal to 5 million BTUs per hour. Affected units are subject to 22E, and the definition is there. Any unit serving a 15 megawatt generator or larger, and large boilers. In addition, certain units that are subject to 22F are going to be subject to 22E if they exceed the 137 pounds per day in a severe ozone non-attainment area and 274 in a serious non-attainment area. you do have one opportunity if you trigger that to accept an enforceable limit to get out of the requirement to be subject to 22E, sort of like a one-time get-out-of-jail-free card. And of course, there are always exceptions and exemptions. For example, mobile sources, including non-road engines, are not subject to this rule, as well as emergency engines, test cells, or units that are solely used for R&D are subject, but they are not required to test. The tune-ups or the reporting requirements don't apply to them. 22F is, as Ricky said, for fuel burning units that are not at major sources, but at area sources. The applicability threshold varies depending on what type of unit, the fuel, the location. So it would be important to look at that rule to determine if your unit is subject. And the applicability thresholds were calculated based on the 137 to 74 pounds per day emission potential. And any dual fuel unit, if it's subject for one fuel, it's subject for all operations. And one thing that's different about this regulation, and the old 22, if a unit was subject on a site, if they triggered the 137 to 74, they were, all units on that site were subject. For this regulation, it's only the one unit. So if a unit triggers that, it becomes subject to 22E. Other units at the site would not be subject to 22E. They would remain subject to 22F. Requirements. So for emergency engines, and this is for both 22E and 22F, the main requirement for those are they are not required. They cannot operate for routine scheduled testing or maintenance on days that are forecasted to be high ozone. There are exceptions to that. For example, some units at hospitals and facilities, broadcasting facilities, that are emergency alert system units, they are not restricted by that, the non-testing, as well as certain model year 2013 or later engines that meet the requirements of CFR, 40 CFR 1029 subpart B. For 22F, the requirements are limited: annual tune-ups for ICI boilers and reciprocating engines. Testing must be at least 180 days apart from each other. Record keeping focuses mainly on the 137 to 74 pounds per day to ensure that those are not exceeded. And reporting is only required if the 137 to 74 is exceeded. And yeah, we can. And you would be required to notify the DEP in 60 days of exceeding the threshold and complying with Section 22E within 170 days, unless you accepted the cap, enforceable cap. 22E has more requirements, and I think the one that's most significant here is that there are emission limits And the emission limits are dependent on the type of unit, as well as the fuel burn and the size of the unit. As Ricky said, we are currently in phase 1, which ends on May 31st, 2023. Phase 2 starts on June 1st, 2023, and continues thereafter until, I guess, there's another standard and there's another regulation. Again, annual tune-ups are required for ICI boilers and reciprocating engines. Stack testing was required every 63 months, which is approximately 5 years plus, which is 5 years plus 3 months, kind of a grace period there. And or in lift for any units that don't have CEM. Large units with that have emitted greater than 100 tons per year are required to have continuous emission monitoring. Record keeping is to demonstrate compliance with these requirements and reporting test results and CM reports. These are major sources essentially, so there are other reporting requirements and other rules, and they are not duplicated here. So what happens if a unit is not able to comply with the emission units? And essentially, an owner and operator has 3 possibilities. One is to cease operation of that unit. If an owner chooses to do that, they need to notify the department and request a permit or registration revocation, or if it doesn't have a permit or registration, then notify the department that they intend to make, or that they have made the permanently disabled the unit. If someone would like to continue operating the unit, there are 2 options. The first option would be to operate in compliance with a subsection G compliance option. The second would be to apply for and receive a case-by-case NOx RACT determination under subsection H. As Ricky has already informed us, phase 1 submittal deadlines are passed, so we're not going to be talking about phase 1, but phase 2, the submittal deadline for an application is September 1st, 2021, just over a year from now. Important thing to note, that there is no emission trading in phase 2. It's been essentially the compliance option that has been used so far, but it does not exist in phase 2. For a case-by-case NOx RACT determination, phase 2 submittal deadline is January 1st of next year, so less than 6 months away. For phase 2, the operating options expire on May 1st, 2028. Any order that is written will have that expiration date within it. So here's just a little diagram of the compliance options that are available. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but what you can see from this is that they're not all available for all types of units. And there are a lot of caveats that go along with each of one of them. So if you're thinking about using one, you need to read them very carefully. The baseline date can change. What the other requirements are pretty detailed, so I'm not going to go into those. There was one question that we received about using more than one, depending on, for one fuel and the other. And I'm not sure how that would work out. It could potentially work out, but it may need to be a case-by-case determination rather than a compliance option. The example that was given was for an ICI boiler operating it as a gas-only unit. And that one won't work because oil firing is limited, and that does address. It's not an exemption. A unit would have to meet the phase 1 emission limits when it's operating on natural gas. And as Ricky said, that it would be implemented through an order or a modification to an existing permit. It would not generally require for NOx a new permit, though, say for water injection or something that's carbon monoxide emissions went up, you would need to look at that to make sure you didn't trigger any of the Section 3A thresholds to be requiring a permit. Next slide. So a case-by-case NOx RACT demonstration. Essentially, what you have to do is demonstrate that all of the available emission control technologies and subsection G compliance options are either technologically or economically infeasible. There is the number there in the parentheses is correct, but the symbol, that is what defines economically feasible. So if the costs are less than $13,635 per ton or equal to, it is considered economically feasible. Infeasible is greater than that amount. So that needs to be corrected. I'm sorry for that confusion there. Recommend a case-by-case emission limit that represents the lowest emission limit reasonable for an emission unit and additional NOx reduction actions. So basically, you need to have a net air quality benefit. So there will need to be additional NOx reduction actions at the facility where the units you were talking about, you're requesting a case-by-case determination at, or at any other facility in the state. Additional options may include air pollution control equipment on another unit, reduction in electric demand, or energy efficiency improvements. And again, I want to reiterate that the demonstration must provide a net air quality benefit. Okay, next slide. And this is just a little details on what is required in a case-by-case demonstration in the application. The determination can't be less stringent than the lowest NOx rate achievable from an emission unit using a cost-effective control alternative. So when calculating cost effectiveness, an owner or operator has to calculate based on the 8760 hours of operation per year, unless an enforceable limit of, on operating hours or any other limit on PTE is in place. The rule allows the owner-operator to concurrently request such a limit, but the net air quality benefit to demonstrate cannot include that reduction in potential emissions. And there is a public participation requirement. You're required to publish in a local paper, local to the unit, describing the demonstration, offering a public hearing, and holding that public hearing if it is requested, and notifying the chief elected official of that municipality. Next. There are forms on the internet to use for both the case-by-case NOx RACT determination and the compliance options. There is a link right there for the phase 2 applications, and they pretty much take you through the requirements. For example, there's check boxes for the compliance option. You can't choose one that isn't for the type of unit you have. For the cost effectiveness worksheet, there is a template for calculating costs that are in an acceptable method for selective catalytic reduction, selective non-catalytic reduction, and high pressure water injection. Unfortunately, the link to that was broken when I went to make these slides. If you would like a copy, please email me. That will be on the next slide, my email address. And I will be working on fixing that link. And so here are both mine and Ricky's email address and contact information. During this time of telecommuting, I'm having some technical difficulties accessing the phone. We had gotten some internet-based stuff, but it's not working currently on my computer. So the best way to get in touch with me is through email. And that's robin.bana@ct.gov. And we can open the floor for questions.
So we got a question.
Yep.
Robin, you mentioned that there's no trading in phase 2.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any potential to use emission credits as part of either a case-by-case plan or any other? I guess my main question is there any value to any credits after phase 2 takes effect, or do they just kind of go away?
They go away. It is possible that as part of a case-by-case, retiring additional credits could be counted not really as part of the net benefit, but part of the overall benefit. So it can't be part of the calculation of net benefit, but it could support the argument that there's an air quality benefit. But yeah, they are essentially, they expire on the date that phase 1 ends and can't be used specifically in phase 2.
Gotcha.
I think we have a bit more time, so if anybody has any more questions. I mean,
And even if you think of something afterwards, just feel free to reach out. I mean, we're available to, to answer anything going forward.
I can also, did people, you sent some questions, I can go over those, the ones that they sent, if that would be helpful to anybody.
Yeah, I think that would be useful.
Okay, so the first question was, can a unit follow different compliance options for each fuel? And I think I've already answered that. I mean, it's possible, but it might need to be a case-by-case determination. And the example given actually just wouldn't work because that already talks about both types of fuel. If you're a gas-only unit or a unit to burn gas 1, you are limited to, 48 hours for testing of oil use for testing and other, or during curtailments. So how will compliance options be implemented? And that's by, as Ricky said, either by an order or through a permit modification. Will that influence what will influence the decision to establish through order or permit? If a permit is chosen, will a complete application be required at the same time as a NOx RACT plan is due? So the application for a permit modification would not be required, only the application for the determination. And I think this would be taken on a case-by-case basis. What made more sense would be for an order or a permit modification. This would not require a new permit. In fact, it specifically says permit modification. So, and the preference of the owner-operator would also be taken into consideration. And if anybody wants more information, if I'm not answering these questions fully enough, please, I don't know if you can raise your hand and ask for more, that is totally fine. If a permit is required to follow a phase 2 compliance option, what would trigger that? Would it strictly be the existing thresholds in section 3A, or would certain other issues trigger permitting? And yes, so you wouldn't expect there to be any triggers in 3A for NOx, because there needs to be a net benefit is going to go down. If the potential to emit for other pollutants goes up sufficiently, then it is definitely 3A trigger that would, what you would need, whether you would need a permit or a permit modification. So this does not have any requirements there. Can DEP provide an example calculation for how to commit to retire an ICI boiler would be evaluated to be used by a compliance option under section 22EG. And I think, again, that would be on a case-by-case basis. There's too many variables for me to make a calculation, especially in the 2 days that I had this. Because it's very theoretical. So if you do have that situation, you can contact me and we will work with you to find a way to do that, and we can review it to ensure that your method you're using is acceptable. But I can't come up with an example at this time. Does the boiler MAC gas unit exemption from oil-fired limits expire on May 1st, 2028, like the other options? Yes. The answer is yes. It seems like the option should be allowed to extend further out if DE is willing to allow that in a permit or order. And I just want to point out that it's not an exemption. It allows that unit owner to operate with the phase 1 limit when operating on gas. There is essentially no limit when they're operating on oil, but that is limited. How often they can operate is limited based on the NESHAP. If a case-by-case RACT determination is approved by DEP, can that be implemented prior to receiving EPA approval per section 22EH? And the answer is yes. DPE will provide EPA with an opportunity to review and comment on the draft order prior to issuance, but the final order is what will be submitted for approval as a SIP revision. And the final question was about testing, and oops, there's some odd noises. Is that? So the regulation states that the existing emission unit perform a compliance test on the date during phase 1. Then the existing unit will be required to perform its first compliance test for phase 2 between May 31st, 2023 and June 1st, 2025. Will this require an existing unit to test in 2 to 3 years as opposed to 63-month cycle? Would this still apply to a source that tests during phase 1 and demonstrates compliance with the phase 2 limits at the time? And that is my reading of the regulatory language, that yes, they would be required to test in a time period that is less than the 63 months cycle. Any other questions?
Good morning, Robin. Brian Freeman at Robinson Nicole here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Could you go back and elaborate a bit on the question regarding the credits and what role credits might play in calculating net benefit versus supporting net benefit?
So they can't, I mean, it's, again, on a case-by-case basis, they cannot be used because they're, what's the language? Is it real and quantifiable, right? They're not going to be real and quantifiable in the phase 2. But so they cannot be used in that way when you're making a calculation of the additional NOx reduction efforts versus the difference between, if the unit that you're applying for did meet the 22 ED limits, right? So you take that and calculate that difference between what they will actually emit and what they would emit if they complied, right? Then you have a number. And you compare that to the net benefit of the additional actions. The additional actions cannot include retiring any credits. Though the one case-by-case RACT order that we did issue included retiring a number of credits. And it was more, I don't want to say just icing on the cake. It wasn't involved in the case-by-case NOx RACT, but it was seen as a supporting action. And could you be a little more specific about what you want to know? Because I'm not sure I'm explaining it well enough.
I'm sorry. Actually, I can't be more specific at this point because the early hour of the day, and I haven't looked at the case-by-case RACT regs in quite some time. But I just wanted to conceptually just solidify in my head.
So they can't be used in your calculations.
That you were drawing.
Right. It can't be used in your calculations, but it might be something that the commissioner would look on favorably in deciding to approve it. That's really, that's sort of vague. I think the important thing is that it cannot be used in your case-by-case demonstration net benefit calculation.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, there aren't any other questions. I guess I'll just, on behalf of everyone, thanks Robin and Ricky, and certainly appreciate your presentation and availability to help folks figure out. There's a lot of detail there, so I'm sure you'll be hearing from folks as they start walking through these phase 2 plans that they're looking to put together. So
there's a lot of detail, but there's even a lot more detail in the regulation. And I think that's maybe the most important thing I can say about this is that an overview doesn't tell you of all the nuances and the exemptions and the exceptions and the, also this it gets pretty convoluted. I have created a checklist for the case by case that, all the requirements that need to be met. If someone is interested, I took all the regulatory language and just put it in a chart so you could make a checklist. Also, the first one that was written is part of a current SIP submission. So it is available on the website. You would just need to go look at the announcements for public hearings and look for the SIP submission public hearing, and that is part of the supporting documents there.
Yeah, and I think, more importantly, or as important, is just to keep in mind the deadlines coming up. So, I mean, if you're unsure or whatever, just reach out and, we'll be happy to answer any questions or to help you out.
Robin, that checklist sounds like that could be very helpful and save a lot of us from having to reinvent that wheel. Would it be possible to make that available?
If you email me, I'll send it to you. And it really is just the regulatory language, put it into a table. But pretty much. So if you email me, I can send it out.
Or if you can provide a single contact for CBIA and that can, broadcast it out to, to members that way. I mean, that's either way is fine.
That'd be great. Thanks. And Robin, one final question. Did I understand with respect to the SIP demonstration, you'd mentioned if I caught the language, there was a stipulation as part of that. Was that in reference to the case-by-case RACT order that you mentioned has already been issued?
Yes. So each case-by-case RACT demonstration needs to be submitted to EPA as a SIP revision. Right. Okay. We're also doing there was a larger SIP revision that was being submitted, and that one is included with that. I think it's so that is included as part of it. So it should be on the web. I was told, I got an email last week that it had been posted.
Great, thanks.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, thanks again. And Chuck, I think we'll kick it back over to you to proceed with the meeting.
Okay, thanks for inviting us over.
Yeah. Thanks, folks.
Take care.
I'm going to kick it back to you, Dave, because your Air Force task is first up. So the rest of your updates from your monthly summary. Go ahead.
Well, I'll be quick since we've been talking about enough air for one morning, but the two things I guess, just to add to what we heard from Ricky and Robin, the GPLPE program that we've been talking about for a while, the regulatory package was rejected by LRC, so it got kicked back to DEEP. There were a number of issues they had with it. They had 7 substantive and 17 technical corrections, but it pretty much came down to wording stuff. So the concept of the program wasn't the issue. It was just kind of what we often see regs review kick back for. So DEEP had revised the rules based on their comments. Appears to have responded to all those and have resubmitted it back to LRC and should be, I'm guessing, on their September agenda, hopefully. So I don't think it's actually been scheduled yet to go up to that. So meanwhile, we have the current GPLPE, which expires in November. So if for some reason the changes that DEEP made aren't satisfactory and it gets kicked back again, then we're probably looking at a real scramble down to down to the expiration of the current GPLPE, where there could be not a lot of time or potentially a gap in between the expiration of the current general permit and these new regulations. So hopefully these changes, the wording changes and the language that they updated is, good to go. And then, by October, these rules will be effective and ready to take over for the GPLP. So stay tuned on that. And then the only other thing, the incinerator exemptions for small units that qualify for the categories that we've been talking about for a while. That regulatory package is still up for comment, but the comment period is closing soon. So to the extent there's any interest in submitting comments on those, September 4th is when those are due. And DEEP did just announce that there hasn't been any requests for a public hearing, so they won't be holding a hearing on that. But that's not surprising. These are pretty simple and pretty good changes. I mean, I think there's a couple little quirks that I think might be worth submitting comments on, just to clarify a few things. But otherwise, these are well, not perfect. I think the way they propose these rules will work for the majority of folks out there. So, but take a look, and certainly, feel free to reach out to Steve or I if anyone feels that there's a reason that we should, get a group of CBIA members together to discuss or pick around ideas. But those are really the only two things I think I had on top of the presentation that we already had. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Dave. So next up is Lee, and hopefully he has something maybe a little more exciting than Eversource and what's happening up at PURA. So Lee, over to you.
Okay, that's just insulting, Chuck, because how would there be anything more exciting than Eversource and what's going on at PURA, I ask you? Seriously.
You caught me in mid-toast bite.
Well, I try to do that. So,
and it's nice that you're all dressed up on a Friday morning from home.
I'm all dressed up on a Friday morning from home because I wanted to bring a sense of solemnity to the proceedings here at the CBIA. And also, I wanted to ask everybody if you could use the chat feature on our WebEx to give Chuck a virtual hug. It's been tough, and so for this week, it should be Hug an Eversource employee. And since Chuck is our favorite Eversource employee, everybody give Chuck a virtual hug in the comments.
Tracy's online too, so Tracy can get some hugs too.
Oh, awesome. Tracy's online? Absolutely. Absolutely. She was our favorite Eversource employee, but she stopped coming to the meetings for a while.
Hey, I do what I can.
Exactly right. And I see that the hugs are filling the chat bar, which is great.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, exactly, because you guys need it, because you're going to be taking it on the chin for a while. So everybody has now learned how to pronounce Isaias, as in tropical storm Isaias, and the fallout from that has been pretty intense. Eversource, to a lesser extent UI, as well as various and sundry cable and internet companies, have all been taking it on the chin for a variety of reasons. Eversource has had it the worst, to be sure. Eversource is now, well, actually, both electric utilities are now faced with a 1-2 punch from both the regulatory authority, the PURA, as well as the state legislature. And unfortunately, we really can't have an energy update without talking about this stuff. So the first thing is that Attorney General Tong and several other individuals called for a two-pronged 1-2 punch with Eversource. The first was in response to ratepayer complaints about how electricity prices shot up on July 1. They asked for an investigation into the rate approval that happened in the spring and whether or not Eversource was entitled to have those higher rates. After the tropical storm, PURA suspended the rate increase and has scheduled a hearing for Monday morning at 10 o'clock to figure out exactly how much money Eversource should really be obtaining through its rate increase that was approved for July 1. To add insult to injury, the legislative leadership, even though the legislature isn't in session, somehow the Energy and Technology Committee is proffering new legislative language to respond to the tropical storm. The Energy and Technology Committee is actually going to have Eversource's CEO, James Judge, in front of it for a hearing on August 27th. And that committee is also proposing new legislation that would link rate increases to utility profit, requiring minimum staffing because a lot of the supposition is that the storm response was inadequate because there weren't enough people around, and also calling for burying power lines. And I will tell you right now that if you bury the power lines, it will be 3 times as expensive as if they're overhead. So good luck with that, folks, because if you're going to complain about Eversource's rates and you're going to ask them to bury power lines, you're operating at cross purposes. Then to make matters worse, PURA, in addition to looking at their rates, has launched 2 dockets. The first docket is 200803, so it was the 3rd docket launched in August in 2020. And it's entitled An Investigation into Electric Distribution Companies' Preparation for and Response to Tropical Storm Isaias. Now that seems pretty reasonable. If you have an investigation into a problem, that's a typical regulatory thing to do. And indeed, there's a great schedule that comports with that. There are a lot of towns and cities who have asked to be a party to that docket. Folks who want to be a party to that docket have until September 4th to do so. And then after that, there will be a very large public comment session that will go on for 3 days in October. Then we'll have testimony in November and hearings pretty much throughout December, a full week and a half of hearings, and then briefing and et cetera, oral arguments scheduled for April 19th, and a final decision is scheduled to come out on April 28th. All in all, that's not too surprising. Sounds like it'll be a very thorough investigation, and it'll be fine. Except the weird part is they've already issued a reopener. So a reopener is what happens after this agency, the PURA, has issued its final decision but wants to reopen it to alter it or amend it or do whatever. And so the PURA has already issued a reopener entitled, oddly enough, 200803 Reopener 1. It's proceeding down a parallel path, which is somewhat odd because the final decision isn't scheduled to come out until April of next year. But the reopener docket is entitled PURA Consideration of Civil Penalty Enforcement Action Against the Electrical Distribution Companies After Storm Isaias Investigation. And that has a schedule as well. And the schedule for that is that the agency will issue a notice of violation, assuming that there's an NOV to be had as a result of the investigation. On May 7th, there'll be a hearing on June 2nd and 3rd, and the final NOV will be issued on July 14th. Chuck, I may be a little rusty on my administrative procedures law, but I think that maybe, despite their saying, if applicable, the PUR may have prejudged the remedy on this one just a little bit. And so I think Rachel Rosen's idea of a group hug is really and truly appropriate because I think that Eversource could stand a group hug at this stage of the game. So that's what's going on in response to the tropical storm and the rate increases from Eversource. What is very interesting about all of this, all kidding aside, because it's now if you're, I know you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm a ratepayer, so I care about this a little bit because I want lower electricity rates, etc. But why should I really care about this as a matter of public policy if I don't work for one of the electric distribution companies? And the reason why is this: it's a little bit interesting because it's now going to have more far-reaching impacts. So as I mentioned, PURA on Monday is holding a hearing. They took back some of Eversource's rate increases that went into effect on July 1, and they put a pin in that, and they've stopped those rate increases. And there's going to be a hearing on Monday to discuss that. And one of the things that Eversource has pointed out, and it's a matter of some debate, but Eversource has said, well, July 1 is when the contract with Millstone went into effect. If you'll recall, the state is paying the state has ordered the electric distribution companies to pay Millstone in a bilateral contract in exchange for Millstone not going away anytime soon. Eversource, by virtue of having 80% of the service territory in Connecticut, is paying 80% of that contract. Eversource has gone on the media and said that that's part of the reason for the rate increase. The other things that have contributed to the higher electric bills aren't so much the rate increases as we're using more power, as we're in our homes working and living in them 24/7 and not going to the office and turning up our thermostats and letting the air conditioner percolate and that sort of thing. But what is interesting is Eversource has realized that all of these renewable energy contracts and all of these zero carbon contracts, including the Millstone contract, are predicated on Eversource pays out extra money in order to affect, and UI for that matter too, but Eversource is the one leading the charge on this. The utilities pay out extra money in order to affect state policy, and in exchange, the regulators allow them to recoup those in rates. And now the regulators have specifically said, we're not so sure we're going to allow you to recoup everything in rates. We're going to go take a look at your rates. This has caused Eversource to be a little more circumspect when it comes to the approvals of some recent renewable energy contracts. So there was a large solar contract that was recently up for approval that got approved a couple weeks ago. And in that approval, the PURA said, we will allow the utilities to seek to recover the cost of this contract in rates, not we will allow the utilities to recover it in rates. And Eversource pointed out, correctly I might add, and UI followed along, but it was on Eversource letterhead, the pleading, so, but both utilities are doing this. They point out that the statutes say, no, we're entitled to recover this in rate recovery, so please amend this ruling, not to say we can seek it, but that we can receive it in rate recovery. And the utilities moved for reconsideration, and PURA just decided on the reconsideration. And what PURA said was, no, you can seek it in rate recovery to the extent that the statute that you're citing applies. It applies when you get to rate recovery. And I don't think that PURA is actually going to disallow the utilities for the renewable energy contracts either at the end of the day, but they're not giving the utilities a warm and fuzzy feeling. As a result of that reconsideration, Eversource has said that it has the right to terminate the renewable energy contract, but it's not at this time going to exercise that right. UI is still making up its mind as to what it's going to do in general, but it calls into question what the utilities will do, assuming that the regulatory authority is going to continue down this track of bifurcating the approval of renewable energy contracts with the rate recovery and telling the utilities that they can wait until later. The utilities are doing what I think is a very common sense thing, which is saying, well, if you're going to let us know if we can't recover these in rates until later, then we're not sure that we're going to enter into these contracts because we don't have to if we can't recover in rates. So we'll wait and see too. And the problem with all of that is the utilities are being absolutely rational, make no bones about it. If I were advising the utilities, I'd tell them to do the exact same thing. However, what this has set up is the contracts are designed to be a nearly guaranteed revenue stream for the renewable energy developers, so the renewable energy developers can get financing from commercial sources and build the project. And you know what? The contracts as they currently stand with this lack of actual regulatory approval that the utilities, one of the counterparties to the contracts, are willing to sign off on, makes it so that none of the renewable energy projects will be financeable on a go-forward basis, assuming this continues. That means that the big wind project out of Bridgeport that is about to get approved, that's probably going to run into problems. It means that DEEP's integrated resource plan that it's working on now, that is predicated on doing several more renewable energy RFPs, is also going to run into problems. DEEP Energy Bureau is trying to figure out what it does in light of this situation, and we got no idea what's going to happen over the next few months or weeks. But it really has thrown a monkey wrench into Governor Lamont's ability and desire to increase renewable energy in the state of Connecticut. Because what's going on right now, while it seems like an esoteric point of rate regulation and rate making, is really going to become problematic. And then finally, speaking of problematic issues, an energy report during the summer wouldn't be complete without an update on the construction stormwater general permit. And that permit, as everybody knows, expires on September 30th. There was a plan that right around now we'd be in the midst of a public hearing if a settlement wasn't reached. I will tell you right now that a settlement has not been reached. The Solar Connecticut, the lobbying arm for the solar industry, has requested a public hearing. The Connecticut Fund for the Environment / Soundkeeper and one other party have also wanted to weigh in on the process. And there's been back and forth with the department on changes to what is commonly referred to as Appendix I on the general permit, which relates to solar development, as well as the general permit as a whole, particularly Connecticut Fund for the Environment / Soundkeeper had some comments on the general permit as a whole, wanted it to be more restrictive. While all these negotiations were going on, DEEP forgot to notice the public hearing in the papers. So the hearing is going to be pushed back. As of today, there is still not a public hearing notice that's gone out. So, or at least as of yesterday, maybe they got it out this morning, but so the earliest that a public hearing could happen is the end of September, and the permit is set to expire on September 30th. So I think that DEEP is either going to have to extend the general permit for a while longer in its current form, or it's going to have to negotiate a settlement in the next few days, or we're going to have a public hearing that butts up against the end of the permit expiry date. And with that, I will shut up and take any questions.
Hey, Lee, it's Derek. I have a question, or probably more of a comment. I'm just wondering, I guess to prove that even after all these years I can still be naive, it seems to me that there's the opportunity here as the legislature and PURA dig into this stuff, and maybe particularly the legislature, that, you reference they're going to come into this conflict between, automatically allowing the utilities to recover costs from ratepayers and, some reconsideration of that approach. And if there is a reconsideration approach, the impact of that on renewable power and solar and the rest of it. So what I'd love to see come out of this is, finally a peeling back of the onion, that, you can't have your cake and eat it too. There's a cost to these things, and, the cost is coming to bear. Now, to your point, a lot of this may be because we're all using more energy in home. But this isn't, really a zero-sum game. Or maybe it is a zero-sum game, I'm not sure. But it's going to force, I hope, people to tear into those bills. And I think somebody told me there's like 23 different fees that go into the, I forget the terminology for that, the public benefit charge, essentially. And then even within those 23, you can peel back some more charges that go into the charges. And so to the extent there's going to be a debate about why these fees have gone up or why your bills have gone up and what to do about it, I hope it forces folks to not just do the knee-jerk, but to really take a solid look once and for all about what have we done with our energy bills over the last 15 years, and what's actually in there, and take a fresh look at it. But like I said, I think that's probably very naive, but it's what I hope for now in energy.
Well, it's incredibly naive, Eric, but God bless you for still being naive. So there's a couple of things to unpack there. First of all, we have some of the highest electricity rates in the country, right? And some of that is born of, we're at the end of a power grid, not in the middle, in New England. We have a particular mix of generation assets and an increasing reliance on renewable energy, all of which drive up costs. However, all 6 New England states have a similar, well, 5 of the 6 New England states have a similar situation. Vermont is getting a crap ton of cheap hydroelectric power from Quebec, and so they're a statistical outlier. So we leave them be for right now. But the other 5 New England states are not all that different from us. And in fact, Eversource, God bless them, operates in 3 of those 5 states, in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, as well as Connecticut. And if Connecticut was the highest, is one of the highest in top 10 in the country, but it's behind Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, then you could say that Connecticut's doing the best it can with what it has geographically. Because across New England, the transmission and distribution costs are roughly the same. The generation cost is absolutely the same because it's the same wholesale market with ISO. And so what the difference is dating back to the Rell administration, the state has figured out that it can fund certain initiatives and policies by attaching things to the ratepayers' bills, which essentially function as a tax, but which don't get the scrutiny and the fiscal note that a tax would get. And we've been doing this at least since the Rell administration. I don't think since the Rowland administration, but we started doing it with the best of intentions when we deregulated the power supply back in the late 90s and went from vertically integrated utilities to what we have now. And the state had to pay back the utilities for the losses that they suffered through that process, and it was appropriate to do so. And they did it through an add-on on the bill. Once the state figured out that it could add stuff onto our bills, it has been doing that like a crack addict going back time and time again, and there's no other way to put it. There probably is a more better way to put it, but not for me. It really is like a drug addiction. And that's where we sit. And so every time we need something new that's tangentially related to energy, we're tacking onto the bill. So I would hope and pray that we look at that we take an honest look at what goes into making a Connecticut electric bill. However, by the same token, if we're going to fund some of the policy initiatives which this state believes in, such as energy efficiency programs, such as renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we're going to have to pay for it somehow. And the only two ways to pay for it are to tax it, put it in the general fund, and then take the funds out of the general fund, or essentially have the utilities themselves act as our tax collectors, which is what we've opted to do. As I'm looking at all of this, and I've been asked to speak later today for something in Fairfield County, hence I look like a lawyer today, I was reminded of the really good work that Kevin Delgado did in 2009 and 2010, where he barnstormed across the state, and he even came and met with us at CBIA and said, I can focus on your rates and I can drive your rates down as the head of the DPUC. I can focus on renewable energy and I can get us cleaner as the head of the DPUC. Or I could focus on system reliability and making sure that the lights stay on better, longer, and are more resilient to storms as the head of the DPUC. But I can't do all three because they're mutually exclusive. If I increase reliability, I'm gonna also increase cost. If I increase the cleanliness of the power structure, I'm also going to increase cost. If I decrease cost, we may be going to fossil fuel, or we may be allowing certain repair and maintenance to slide, and so I decrease reliability and the cleanliness of the power supply. And when Dan Esty came into office as head of DEEP in 2011, his mantra was, as we all remember, cleaner, cheaper, more reliable. And it can't be that. It might be able to be two, but it can't be all three.
Well,
that's my thinking.
Yeah, just a footnote, because I hadn't looked at it for a while, so I just pulled up the EIA data. May 2020 residential electricity prices, Connecticut even higher than Alaska, second only to Hawaii. So I guess it depends on what sector you're looking at and so forth. But in terms of the average residential price of electricity for May 2020, it's Hawaii and us.
That's right, and Hawaii has real problems because it doesn't have enough fuel. It doesn't have enough fuel to run its systems, and doesn't have enough renewable energy. So it's literally having to bring in liquefied natural gas on tanker trucks and that tanker boats and that kind of thing.
Exactly. So my message, and then I'll shut up, would be not that anybody would or even consider listening, but I think cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable are relative terms. It's obvious where we've gone with that. It's obvious what we've sacrificed and what we've focused on. Our focus is on zero carbon, 100% non-carbon fuels, and the price of that, even at this juncture, and we've got a ways to go, is that it's less in Hawaii. So to me, it's all about transparency. If you want to go, if that's where the state is and the region is, we want to go 100% renewable. We don't want any carbon. That's fine. Just understand what the implications of that are economically.
And it's not
a soapbox.
Yeah, and it's not just the implication of. By the way, Marcy, Todd Berman's trying to make a comment, but his phone is muted. So can we unmute him? I don't know why he's texting me about it, but there it is.
Can you guys hear me now?
Oh, now we can hear you. Yeah, what's up, Todd?
So I just want to add, those are great comments, both Lee and Eric, and I share them both. But I want to overlay another. So I've been working with the GC3 utility infrastructure group, and I just want to lay another layer of complication on the whole project problem, right? So Eric, you're thinking sort of the look back. Lee, you're kind of looking at the present state. But to add more complications, the future state, right? We either are going to have, in terms of making our distribution infrastructure more resilient, that is an incredible. There are so many oppose stakeholder views on that, and the cost component of some of the visions are I mean, Lee, you know what undergrounding looks like. But I think, Eric, you said we all just got to look at this like wide open. We also got to think about, adapting the distribution infrastructure to a changing climate. I mean, that is a real thing that is really happening, and it's incredibly expensive. It's just another layer of complication to the whole thing.
Yeah, it is, Todd. The other thing that I'll note is, two other things that I'll note is, one, we've shifted the conversation from cheaper electricity to cheaper renewable electricity, as though we can no longer look at fossil fuel plants. And I think that the IRP has done that. The last IRP has done that. I am quite certain that this IRP is going to do that. And I get where you're headed with transmission and distribution hardening for sea level rise and storms and the like. And yes, we absolutely have to look at that. And you've got differing opinions as to whether or not undergrounding will help, because as you get closer to Long Island Sound, are those underground vaults going to flood? And are we going to have different problems other than wind damage? And engineers differ in their opinions, but there's a difference of opinion, and it's valid. It's not like, whether or not masks cause carbon dioxide poisoning.
Right. Lee, I'm not, if I took a position on undergrounding, I should have been clear. I'm not. I'm just saying it's this unbelievably complex question.
Yeah.
That still lays it's right in our path, in our, as a culture, we're going to have to confront that. So.
That's exactly correct. And the other thing that we need to take a long, hard look at is California has been having problems. I don't know if anybody's been following, but they've been having rolling blackouts in part because they're keeping their fossil resources fairly thin. They've been mothballing and retiring a bunch of fossil fuel resources as renewables have come online. And when a couple of them went down and there was a big spike in the heat this summer, California had blackouts that had nothing to do with storms. And that could absolutely happen here in New England, make no bones about it. We don't have sufficient energy storage, batteries, if you will, to allow for the intermittency of renewables. If you've got a couple of hot, cloudy days that are fairly windless, our renewable energy production will go down. If we don't have the fossil units in order to jack that back up, you're going to have issues. That's why it isn't coffee that's in this mug. It's bourbon.
Okay, Lee, I know you have to leave shortly. Just a couple of comments from, an Eversource perspective a little bit about stuff. I mean, there are a lot of people obviously working on all the dockets and hearings that we're going to have coming up, and there'll be a lot of information. A lot of it will be in paper form. There'll be snippets, obviously, the media will pick and choose from, and you'll see in the newspapers and on TV and stuff like that. One of the things you mentioned, undergrounding it 3 times. It's actually more than that, and it can be, depending on where you are, it can be significantly more than that. But there are numbers on that. Another thing is that you didn't mention, and I know there's a lot going on, but we also have a bunch of filings on the grid modernization dockets, where a lot of the new stuff that's coming out to do a resilient dockets, to do things like battery storage and stuff like that. Part of that grid modernization, and there's a lot of different programs and concepts that are part of that, which will, in the end, cost money, obviously. So, but that's a longer term project. And just going back to the storm, and some people may have heard this, they may have heard it from us. It's not something the media likes to pick up on. But this storm, we had more damage than we did for either Sandy or Irene. And when I say damage, we had more infrastructure damage, more, hot or trouble spots, or we call them events that we had to fix and stuff like that. And in the end, we restored power 33% faster than those storms. I mean, we did substantial completion in 8 days. Sandy was 11 and Irene was 12. And and that's in the COVID area. I mean, there are a lot of restrictions on how our crews can operate in this area, including the crews that are coming from out of state. For example, one of the most significant ones is one person per truck. So obviously there's a lot more trucks and it takes a lot more vehicle traffic to get to any particular outage and event and whatever. So there are a lot of people working on this. I'll just say that to leave you with that thought that from a restoration perspective, overall, we did better. So now there may be other things that people can look at in terms of, communication to customers. Some of our systems obviously went down and stuff like that. And there'll be obviously a lot of attention on some of those things in these hearings and investigations and filings and et cetera. But just wanted to get my 2 cents in. Okay, anything else before Lee goes down to save Fairfield County?
Can you hear me? This is Matt Rinelli.
Yes.
Yeah. Just one note on the conversation about rates. I think they are really good comments, and this is an issue, but I guess I would just add to it, recall that Connecticut had high power rates long current renewable energy policy. So, I think, look at all components, there is something that goes beyond, our renewable energy goals. We've had among highest power, back to 2000, back to the time of restructuring.
But Matt, I will both agree and disagree with you because I'm a lawyer. I can do that. The cause for the price spikes at the beginning of deregulation were in part a result of our fuel mix, because we were so heavily reliant on natural gas that when the natural gas prices spiked, particularly when we had a couple of cold winters, our electric rates spiked. And so you could follow along the curves of natural gas and electricity prices would run parallel to one another. But natural gas hit a 25-year low this July where it was trading at around $1.60, $1.65. And so the wholesale market, power is actually cheaper now than it used to be. And we can debate about the cost of renewables, but everybody in New England is either all in or mostly in on renewable energy. It's not as though Connecticut is the statistical outlier. So I don't mean to say that renewable energy is driving the renewable energy itself is driving the price hikes, but Connecticut rather than incentivizing renewable energy through the general fund, Connecticut is incentivizing renewable energy through the ratepayer bill. And so that results in a delta in the ratepayer bill that isn't necessarily reflected in other jurisdictions. The other jurisdictions are still paying for it, and the price of renewable energy as compared to fossil fuel has been plummeting, and it's getting to the point where the two are going to meet. But for right now, it has to do with how we're handling it on our bill versus our taxes, at least in part. So again, more hugs for Chuck, more hugs for Tracy, and I'll leave you with that. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Lee. Take care.
Thank you, Chuck.
And drive safe.
I'm not driving, I'm Zooming.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Zoom safe.
Because it's COVID.
There you go. So next up, we have Mark, who's going to be doing the Waste Task Force summary. Harold is unable to be here today, so I will turn it over to Mark.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So Harold couldn't make it, and there's a two-part presentation, one of which is Eric, if you're still on, giving an update on the spill report conceptual approach and the CBIA comments. And then for those of you who have the handout that Harold and I prepared, I'll walk through that, and then I have a couple of things to add. So Eric, I don't know did you want to go first?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Mark. Amazingly, as I pull up the comments, they disappear on me, but I'll pull them right up again. So, as you probably know, if you're interested in the topic at all, and we had Deep at a recent meeting to go over their conceptual model for proposing spill reporting regulations this fall. And I've been pounding your emails with drafts and finals and so forth. So hopefully you've all seen, if not the draft, the final form that we submitted yesterday. And just to keep in mind the context, essentially what we were commenting on was a PowerPoint presentation that I think I sent out with the draft anyways, that kind of lays out conceptually with some degree of detail in certain areas what DEEP's currently planning to propose. And I suspect they've already have the regulation pretty much written. But they put that out, which I thought was great. Our folks, you folks got a lot of good questions into them at our meeting with DEEP. And so what we did was just sort of compile the questions and comments that came up. We did have a separate phone call, Zoom call with E2 folks that were particularly interested. And we came up with several themes. First and foremost, seemed to be concerned about the 24-hour or the 1 hour reporting period. So that kind of led our comments, trying to convey that in the real world, whether you're a small company, gas station, or a very large company, for different reasons, 1 hour can be problematic. So we essentially said that, we could do for 1 hour to initiate some sort of response to it. But we ought to have 24 hours to complete that process. And again, this is for not the category 1 spills, which are the tanker truck and so forth falling over. This is relatively small releases of material. So, anyways, the reporting time frame was one theme. The whole issue of follow-up reports and closeouts. We tried to find, and again, for each of these, we tried to provide specific recommendations. So on the closeout, we basically wanted DEEP to have a time frame within which they would ask for follow-up reports if they wanted them. And then the way we constructed this proposal anyways was if we didn't hear from them within that time frame, the incident would be deemed closed and left a little wiggle room for them if some evidence came out subsequently that the environment wasn't adequately protected, that at that point it could be reopened. But again, just some suggestions on that. And we had some concerns and questions about the concentration threshold of 30% concentration. We thought maybe there were some simpler ways to address that in terms of the distinction between industrial grade products and consumer products. And then we just kind of did a laundry list of clarifications that you folks brought to our collective attention and transmitted those through. So those went through to you guys as a draft and then got comments back and plugged as many of those in as I could to fit with the overall theme of our comments. And then sent them in. So I don't want to go through them in any more detail than that. I'd rather open it up for questions or comments if you have any. And then just a reminder, and I don't know, maybe some people know better than me. I guess at this point I'm anticipating a public notice for the formal regulations, maybe as early as September or certainly by October, because this is part of DEEP's 20 by 20 goals. So I would think they'd want to get these as far along in the process, if not fully adopted through the reg review committee by the end of the year if possible. So I'd expect to see something in September on a public notice. So that's a quick overview. Any questions or comments?
So Eric, this is Chuck. Eversource filed its own comments as well. I'd be interested if anybody else on this call filed comments on behalf of their company or on a client. And I don't know if anybody knows whether DEP will be posting any comments that it received yesterday somewhere on the website, if they've heard anything. I didn't see anything when I looked this morning, but so if anybody else has filed comments or did it on behalf of their company, their client, that's on this call. Okay, hearing silence. Eric, do you know of any other entities that were planning on filing comments?
I believe Environmental Professionals of Connecticut was planning to file comments. I didn't see them, but that was my understanding. There were one or two companies that, put comments together but didn't really want to submit them under their own name, so they forwarded those to me, and I tried to incorporate the main themes of those. And they seemed, they were largely consistent with what we already put together. So, but I'm not aware of any other entities that under their letterhead are putting comments in.
Well, I am pretty sure EPOC submitted comments. We got a letter, so I think it went in.
Yeah, I had a strong indication that was going to happen. I can't confirm that.
So just an interesting tidbit.
Rachel, if you're familiar with those, is there any just sort of headline, or how would you characterize the nature of the comments, just broadly?
I would have to go back and pull it. There's been so much gone through in the last couple of days.
Sure.
We're also commenting on the RSRs, so there's a lot of traffic. I'm sorry, I can't give you a summary.
So from our perspective, we commented on the 5-gallon thing. We wanted it to be consistent with Mass. Well, to somewhat consistent with Mass. Mass has 25 gallons for our transformer fluid and 10 gallons for oil and petroleum, so we asked for that. The 1 hour is, we went back and looked, and almost none of our hundreds of spills over the last couple of years were cleaned up. Less than 5 gallon spills were cleaned up less than an hour. So we asked for additional time from, spill discovery, and then, how long before you respond, et cetera. We also commented on the historical, I think you did too, that it should be from the release occurring and discovered after the data regulations. There were a number of comments and concerns during that virtual meeting on July 20th on that topic, and so that was a concern. So, and just as a point, a tidbit, during the storm Isaias, if I'm saying that right, we had just short of 290 spills across Connecticut that we had to deal with. All right, that's it.
Chuck, I just want to add on the wave 2. My understanding is that the AG's office has signed off on those, so that I believe they're pretty clear to head their way towards the Reg Review Committee. Few people have contacted me with great concern about particularly the applicability section. So an effort is underway to meet with some folks on the Reg Review Committee to alert them and of that concern. As you can imagine, with all that's been going on in the world, and with energy and power outages and social unrest and everything, the legislature has a lot on their plate. They're still considering a September special session. Sorry, Chuck. Yeah, so I'm not sure what the time frame will be for that proposal to get through the rest of the process, but I think we've at least alerted folks on the Reg Review Committee that there's some concerns. So that may, even if they don't have time to sit down and kind of flush through those, in the short term, maybe that's enough to encourage some delay until they can have that kind of conversation. So we'll see what happens.
Hello, Eric.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Deb DeFelice. How are you?
Hi, Deb. Good. How are you?
I just want to, and I know it was in what you submitted, but I just want to remind people, if you haven't looked at Appendix A of the spills, the proposed spills, is supposed to be materials that are so hazardous that they want any amount reported to them immediately. But then they included the RMP list, which includes 255 common materials like propane, and any flammable over 10,000 pounds. That's because RMP is large amounts of hazardous materials. So that would literally mean that when we're changing propane on a fork truck and had any amount, we technically have to, and that's one of the materials, but if you look at the list, there's 255 materials plus all flammables. It's obviously, it's things that have threshold planning quantities of 10,000 pounds, 20,000 pounds. It's really not, doesn't fit in that list. So I just wanted to point that out to people. I'm going to go back on mute.
Deb, before you do, I just wanted to thank you for pushing those through, and I wish I could have called you to follow up. So I kind of just stuck the comment in there, but love to flesh that out with you sometime. I don't even know what RMP stands for, but so when it comes time to comment on the formal regulations, we can be a little bit more detailed, and I apologize that just kind of had to do a quick cut and paste. It sounds like a really genuine, legitimate concern that we emphasize more than we probably did in this comment.
Thank you.
Eric?
Yeah.
It's Beth Barton. That was an excellent point that Deb raised. Back to the RSRs, appreciating everything you said, and really it sounds like what you have to do is just pretty much convince them that the ramifications are such that they have to delay it, because practically, which I totally understand, they're not going to delve into it. Do you think it would be helpful, maybe some of the consultant firms might have some examples, and wouldn't necessarily have to attach anybody's name to it, to look at some of the cleanups that have occurred under other regulatory provisions or to sediments, et cetera, and contrast what the cost difference would be to someone if they had to comply with the RSRs? I remember there was a point very early on, and I'm forgetting who it was, but they gave a couple of examples of where addressing something, for example, under the SEH statute, as you know, with a focus on abatement, which obviously is addressing threats to human health and the environment. If they had to instead comply with every nuance of the RSRs, there was this huge delta in terms of the cost without an attendant benefit to human health and the environment. I'm just wondering if thinking about the way things work up in your milieu up there, if there were a couple of examples that could be given to them to just highlight or drive home why this is such a big deal in terms of cost to the business community without associated incremental benefit to human health and the environment, that might assist in at least getting them to hold off.
Yeah, I think real-world examples are always helpful in that regard, Beth. The other thing with reg review is, so that's the sort of the consulting community. From the legal community, to the extent there's, any argument that can be made that what's being proposed, either in the language itself or by the impact of it, kind of goes to a place that the legislature more than likely wasn't contemplating when when they gave the authorization to do this. The other thing on specific examples, particularly that can be helpful, if you go to the General Assembly's website and pull up the list of membership for the Reg Review Committee, especially if you look at the chairs, Craig Minor and Jim Maroney. So I think you've got, you got the northwest corner, you've got, I think, the Manchester area, and then down in, I don't know what Claritas Dietrich's district is, I've forgotten. She's down in Seymour somewhere, I think. So anyways, that's really helpful too for sort of closed door sit-down meetings to say, hey, you got this industrial park, or you've got this facility, or that went through a cleanup, and if they had to do it now, it would, or maybe they wouldn't have had to done it before, but now they have to do it, or it would cost 5 times as much. Anything like that that's sort of personal to a particular legislator's district, obviously can be especially helpful.
Plus, remember, assuming the point is going to come when we make the transition to release-based, you're not going to be just talking about the applicability of the RSRs to site-wide cleanups. You're going to be talking about the applicability of the RSRs to cleanup of specific releases. So I think you juxtapose so many requirements of the RSRs that don't stop at addressing the immediate release, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in the context within which we use them today. But I think we just have to think ahead or read whatever's in there with the understanding or with the lens of them being what will be applicable if we're now release-based as opposed to site-wide and activity-triggered cleanup.
Yeah, good point. Really good point. So I'll keep folks in touch with, if we get a meeting schedule, maybe we want to have a representative or two of both the legal and the consulting community to be part of that, to sort of talk about, real world implications at a high level. So thank you, Beth. That's a good point. Okay, Mark, I think we're done with the spill and cleanup, so I'll kick it back to you.
Okay. I just had a couple editorial comments on the RSRs that if you read the DEEP summary of comments, they devoted 3 paragraphs to explain their approach to any revisions for a 150-page document. And, there were some key comments submitted, and I can't remember if this was Seth or Ethan, but over 30 references to including but not limited to, and that language is still in there. And then they added a new definition for background concentration, which is validated conceptual site model, but the word or the term validated isn't defined. So I think there's a lot of work still to do on the RSRs, and I'll just leave it at that. But I appreciate, Eric, your suggestion to, lead the charge and begin dialogue with regulation review, because it's a little scary. For those of you who have the handout, I'd like to refer to page 12, discussion of MIRA and Public Act 14-94. And it looks to me like there's the MIRA and DEEP reached an impasse. The commissioner sent the letter in July to the president of MIRA, and it was rather terse and unfortunate. And I had a note in the handout about something that was stated at the last meeting, which is from MIRA's perspective, we are unable to establish a viable project plan to move forward. And what that means for the state of Connecticut is, possibly 500 to 600,000 tons of waste going on long-haul transport or rail car to other states. And the numbers for out-of-state disposal range from 400,000 tons to upwards of 700,000 tons. So it's basically the equivalent of one very large waste energy facility or even landfill, just disappearing from the state and all that waste moving out of state. I also wanted to mention that there are capacity constraints with the existing facilities. Just by way of example, I took a look at the first 2 weeks of August compared to the same period in 2019. And I think due to COVID and also Tropical Storm Baltimore, we had a spike in solid waste. And even in the sleepy town where Jay Farron lives, the numbers for increased volume during that time period. So in the first week I looked at 60% increase, and then the second week of August, 52% year over year. And that's just an example. I mean, the same numbers show up for West Hartford, Waterbury, New Britain. So the larger communities had massive amounts of debris, in addition to which COVID has resulted in a lot of people working from home. So the residential trash has really skyrocketed. And at the same time, we're seeing, really fundamental changes in the world of recycling. So a number of things to mention with regard to recycling. One is obviously China banning materials coming from the US, and not only China, but now shipping companies, major shipping companies that handle huge cargo ships. They're no longer willing to transport that material to Southeast Asia. Markets are very volatile and prices are low. And then a number of recycling facilities were closed temporarily for COVID-related issues, and those included the city of Baltimore, Edmonton in Alberta, a few other locations. I haven't heard of anything like that happening in Connecticut, but one of the waste transfer stations was closed for about 2 months in the town of Wallingford. So there are really serious issues ahead for the waste issue, waste management, solid waste and recycling. And what I find interesting is DEEP apparently is getting a lot of requests for pre-application meetings. And they're coming from a variety of different companies and technologies. And one of the things that apparently that DEEP holds up as a important criteria is consistency with the Comprehensive Materials Management Strategy, aka Solid Waste Management Plan, or CMMS. And that document was finalized, I believe, in 2016. And a lot has happened since that time. And unfortunately, I feel, it's in desperate need of an update or reevaluation. And there doesn't appear to be any willingness on the part of the commissioner or her staff to dive into that effort. So we're stuck with this very outdated approach to, how to evaluate waste management, recycling, et cetera. And there's just a disconnect between the reality in the marketplace, the ability to permit facilities, the economics involved, and the kind of pie-in-the-sky approach that DEEP took in the CMMS. So I also wanted to mention on page 4 of the handout, there's some relief offered both by DEEP on hazardous waste generators and transfer facilities. And there are 2 versions referenced in the handout. One is the DEP version and the other is the EPA version. And I believe that the DEP guidelines have jurisdictions and not the EPA approach, but just as a reminder, we have in the past made efforts to try to encourage DEEP to adopt the most recent CFR on hazardous waste that was updated by EPA, and I haven't heard anything for months about this, but I think the last go around there was mention that they might tackle an update to the 2008 CFR, the federal CFR. So, that's another example of stalled action on the regulatory front. So, one final note, and this again touches on challenges in the recycling industry. In the state of Florida, the governor signed a bill which would relieve the waste haulers from picking up contaminated recyclables. And there's a whole protocol in the federal or the Florida law about what municipalities would have to do contractually in order to hold the contractors responsible for picking up material. But I think it's a little bit scary in the sense that people rely on a service and the education piece is not being addressed comprehensively by many states. So people don't know what is recyclable and what is not recyclable. And then, some of the things that the regulators call recyclable or designate as recyclable are really not being recycled. So, I'm a little concerned that other states may follow the lead of Florida, which I think poses a risk for confrontation between contractors and municipalities, between the contractors and their customers. And it's a real difficult situation, but, that's Florida. But I don't see something like that being feasible in Connecticut, but I think it's worth keeping an eye on. Lastly, I wanted to mention that last year, in 2019, there was a fair amount of optimism about improved markets for paper products. So paper is important because it makes up something like 55% of the recycling mix. It makes up 23% of the MSW mix, and the inability to export material to China prompted backup in the piers and at warehouses and recycling facilities where people had baled paper and had no market for that material, and prices were really poor if people were even able to sell it or pay someone to take it. So back in 2019, there were a number of optimistic projections about new paper mills coming online and expansions of paper mills with the promise that this would really make a big dent in the backup of material, the pricing, the availability of markets, and so forth. But most recently, closures were announced for a number of companies, including large mills in Duluth, Wisconsin Rapids, Burlington, Ontario, Mobile, Alabama. And so the pipeline for paper products as a feedstock for recovered material appears to be contracting, and a lot of it is based on market conditions which changed during COVID. So, I think we'll see updates in the trade publications and at conferences and webinars regarding the paper recycling markets and any new mills that come online, but it's not good news. And you know, across the board, markets have not been favorable for metals, for plastics, and there's nothing for glass, and hasn't been for years. But DEEP is unwilling to consider revising the regulations to remove glass from the list of required recyclables. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, comments.
Mark, I just wanted to add a kind of on a related note. We've received some communication from the American Chemistry Council about, I guess, an organization called the Toxics Packaging Clearinghouse, which I think is something similar to these entities that are set up around, you know, electronics recycling and some other types of packaging and so forth. Apparently it's come out with a new model legislation that bans all PFAS and orthophthalates in all packaging, not just food contact packaging. So, and there's, I guess, some comments that are due in early next week. So they're looking for some support on that. Normally with this kind of issue, you know, in the past, at least my understanding, has been confined to the food industry, and we kind of, you know, give way to those specific trade groups to lead the charge on this. What I'm not sure of, I'm not sure I have the time of, but I know there's some people on this call that are pretty familiar with PFAS. I don't know how widespread PFAS and orthophthalates are in just regular packaging, cardboard or otherwise. In other words, would this have broad implications far beyond the food and grocery industry if PFAS and orthophthalates were banned from any kind of packaging at all? Does anybody on the call have any knowledge of that or insights?
There was a chat saying, yes, it will have broad impacts, which does not surprise me because, I mean, these materials, you know, particularly the PFAS, you're talking about thousands of compounds, and the notion of trying to identify whether or not they're in a product, I think that would be a daunting task.
And is it, you know, in a typical, I thought Matt might have some insight into this, and you can just unmute yourself if you want, Matt, but so a typical packaging that would come through from Amazon or whatever, you've got the cardboard, and then you have, at least I still get sort of the bubble wrap, plastic bubble wrap stuff. Is that where the PFAS would likely show up, or would it be in the cardboard itself or the tape that, you know,
I think not necessarily in those items, but again, you know, the reason it's used in the food, right, is because it has great resistance to oil absorption, fat absorption, grease absorption, and so anytime you have any kind of that type of organic thing, I understand it's also sometimes used to improve the performance of the printing or whatever, so you don't get bleed in certain paper products and stuff like that. So, but it's just so ubiquitous for so many reasons. I would say, and the other problem, Eric, is the concern in drinking water at the very low limits, but the ability has brought out the ability to detect PFAS at very low concentration. So anytime somebody's saying none, what they mean is none detected. So, you know, if you could detect at very low limits and somebody Malcolm just commented, anything waterproofing, and again, your packaging, you want to usually protect it against moisture absorption and stuff like that. So I would think it could be very widespread.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. I don't know, Malcolm, do you have anything you want to add? Do you want to unmute or? Okay. All right. Well, that's helpful. Sounds like.
Hey, Eric, it's Beth. Just one thing I want to throw into the mix, and I think it does come up when you're talking about any prohibition of this nature, and that is the reality of there still being a lack of analytical protocol for the detection, particularly at these incredibly low levels, of chemicals in whatever substrate you're going to be looking at. That continues to be a big problem, and I think we're starting to see some cases happen throughout the country relative to what the argument would be a misuse or a simple extrapolation of the protocol or the analytical methods for evaluating the presence of PFAS compounds in drinking water.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, great. Well, based on that feedback, I think I might just try and draft up something general to lend support to. They also name names at PEEP in terms of who they'd like to this to be sent to, which will probably come as no surprise. Some of the names, Yvonne Bolton, Tom Metzner, and so forth. So I'll draft something up generally. These are due, I think, on the 24th. If anybody has a thought, a sentence or a clause or whatever you think would be appropriate to put in there, just let me know. But otherwise, at this juncture, I don't know if there's any appetite to do this in Connecticut or any effort to do it in Connecticut yet. I haven't heard of that, but another thing for folks to keep your ears open for. But it sounds like it's worth us chiming in on this, at least at a high level at this juncture. So thank you.
Okay, I know we're running over, but Deb and Wojtek, if you got anything on the water, I'm sure you do. It's your turn.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Can now.
Hello?
We can hear you, Wojciech.
Yes.
Okay, great. So Debbie had to step away to see a client. So I'm just going to be brief. Obviously, you know that the miscellaneous general permit and the significant industrial users general permit are being finalized. There was another set of comments that a POTW group submitted recently for consideration specific to this significant industrial user general permit. So we'll hopefully hear more about these efforts from Ozzy in his update next month, which is September, during the E2 meeting. So that's kind of all we had to report.
So Wojciech, you said Ozzy will be at our September meeting then?
Correct, yes. So I think Marcy was able to get a hold of him and pencil him in for our September meeting.
Yep, okay. Cool. Well, that's good. I'm glad it sounds like you got it figured out. So that's awesome.
Debbie's back.
Yes, I can hear her. I'm not sure if she's talking to us or a client, but...
Okay. Anybody have any questions for Wojtek? Okay, then. Any final
Right,
comments,
thanks, guys.
Marcy or Eric? Want to remind us of anything, Marcy? Nope. Okay, everybody, have a good weekend. Stay safe. Hug a friend or a family member, but no one else.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Chuck.
Bye-bye.